Welcome, everyone. We want to welcome you to part one of three of a webinar series with Dr. Ross Greene, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, Overview of New Perspectives and New Practices with Students who are struggling with behavior. If you're not familiar with who Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center is, just a little bit about us. We are Connecticut's federally funded parent training information center, and we're a statewide nonprofit organization, and we offer free training, information, and support related to special education for families and professionals. This presentation is part of a special project that we're doing with the Connecticut Statewide Family Engagement Center, the Connecticut Family School Partnerships. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Ross Greene is a clinical psychologist and the originator of the evidence-based approach called Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, or CPS, as described in his influential books, The Explosive Child, Lost at School, Lost and Found, and Raising Human Beings, and the soon-to-be release, The Kids Who Aren't Okay, the urgent case for reimagining support, belonging, and hope in schools. Dr. Greene was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for over 20 years and now oversees the nonprofit he founded in 2009, Lives in the Balance, which advocates on behalf of kids with concerning behaviors and their caregivers and provides vast free resources on the CPS model. Dr. Greene has worked with several thousand kids with concerning behaviors and their caregivers, and he and his colleagues have overseen implementation and evaluation of the CPS model in countless schools, inpatient psychiatry units, and residential and juvenile detention facilities with dramatic effect. Significant reductions in recidivism, discipline referrals, detentions, suspensions, and the use of restraint and seclusion. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Greene.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to do this. And I'm so glad so many of you are able to join in on this. And I know that we have both parents and educators in our audience. So I will be speaking to both of those groups. Um, this model is the same, whether it's in a school or in a family or in an inpatient psychiatric unit or in a residential facility or in a prison. It's the same model. No matter where it's being used, the goal is to move from methodologies that are about power and control to methodologies that are instead about collaboration and problem solving. Um, Power and control hasn't worked and isn't going to for the kids we've most often been applying power and control strategies to. Um, that's why it's the same kids in every school, for example, same 10, 15 kids who are accounting for 70 to 80% of the discipline referrals that occur in that school. And in many schools, all of the punitive, exclusionary, disciplinary procedures that take place after those discipline referrals. It's no different in families, no different in treatment facilities. Those are the kids who tend to be struggling the most, and we just keep punishing them the most. Apparently, we have great faith in rewarding and punishing, even when those strategies clearly aren't working. Those kids, and in my view, every other kid, needs something different. Now, in the parentheses there, it says, and meeting kids where they're at. We're not ready for the next slide yet. In the parentheses, it says, and meeting kids where they're at. That is the definition of good parenting. Um, that's the definition of good teaching, meeting every kid where they're at. Notice it doesn't say meeting somebody else's kid where they're at. That's somebody else's kid. If you're a parent, your job is to meet your kid where they're at. If you're an educator, believe it or not, even tougher, your job is to meet every kid where they're at. And that's a whole lot better for both adults and kids than trying to meet kids where they're not at. Um, okay, now we're ready for the next slide. We're going to be spending our time together here covering the key themes of the collaborative and proactive solutions model. So if you're familiar with the explosive child or lost at school or lost and found or raising human beings, and as you heard from Jen, the soon to be published The Kids Who Aren't Okay, um, these are the themes that are woven throughout all of those books. Let's start with key theme number one. Now, for some of you, these are going to be paradigm shifts. Um, this model is different than the way a lot of us were raised. This model is different than the way a lot of us were trained. Here we go. Many of us were trained, in the case of kids who are struggling with their behavior, to focus on their behavior and to try to modify that behavior through some rather straightforward strategies, usually involving rewarding and punishing. That's not what you're doing in this model. You're not rewarding and punishing in this model. So, no timeouts, no sticker charts, no holding kids in from recess, no holding kids after school, no detentions, no suspensions, no expulsions. Goodness,
Mhm.
this may sound pretty far-fetched, eh? Well, you don't need those strategies when you are instead focused on the problems that are causing those behaviors and solving them. In this model, you as a caregiver, once again, whether you're a parent or an educator or a staff member in a treatment facility, your role is problem solver, um, not behavior modifier. Now, the minute I say that, many people ask the following question: how is the kid's behavior going to improve if you're not busy modifying it? Well, in this model, you are improving behavior by solving the problems that are causing that behavior. We call them unsolved problems. We also call them problems that have yet to be solved. We also call them problems that are waiting to be solved. How do we know they're waiting to be solved? Well, because they're still causing concerning behaviors. Um, let's go on to the next slide. Um, let me give you some examples of unsolved problems. At home, that might, I can't be exhaustive here, it would take the entire hour. At home, unsolved problems could include things like difficulty brushing teeth before going to bed at night, um, difficulty turning off the Xbox to come in for dinner, difficulty turning off the Xbox to go to bed at night, difficulty turning off the Xbox to engage in any other much more meaningful aspect of living, difficulty eating what mom or dad has made for dinner, difficulty being in bed by 9 p.m. with the lights and electronics off, difficulty going to school, difficulty going to school on time. Just a sampling. Unsolved problems at school could include things like difficulty coming back into the classroom after recess, difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math, difficulty sitting next to Susie during circle time, difficulty agreeing with Billy on the rules of the Foursquare game at recess. Now I'm going to repeat two because there's overlap on these between home and school. Difficulty coming to school, difficulty coming to school on time. Once again, I could go on forever. Those are unsolved problems. Expectations kids are having difficulty meeting that often give rise to concerning behavior in kids who are prone to concerning behavior. What does that tell us? It tells us that the concerning behavior is the kid's frustration response. It's the distress response. Used to call it the stress response, but lately I've been calling it the distress response because that brings us all the way back to infancy. infants have distress responses. Um, what do we do when an infant has a distress response? And by the way, distress responses in infants can signal to us that an infant is hungry, thirsty, hot, cold, has indigestion, distress responses. What do we adults do when an infant is exhibiting a distress response? We try to figure out what's getting in the way. We try to do something about it to try to address it. And then we watch very closely to see if our solution got the job done. 10-year-olds have distress responses. 14-year-olds have distress responses. 5-year-olds have distress responses. They tell us that there's an expectation a kid is having difficulty meeting. But something happens on the way away from infancy. We start viewing those distress responses, we start interpreting them as attention seeking, manipulative, coercive, unmotivated, limit testing. And that's when we stop trying to figure out what's getting in the kid's way. We stop trying to do something about it. We stop paying attention to whether our intervention got the job done because what we're busy doing is trying to simply modify or squash the distress response, the frustration response. I don't know why we shift gears. Um, 3-year-olds have unsolved problems, 8-year-olds do, 12-year-olds do, 17-year-olds do. And how do they let us know that there's an expectation they're having difficulty meeting? Through their frustration responses, through their distress responses. So those concerning behaviors are simply communicating to us. We've all heard the cliche, all behavior is communication. What is concerning behavior communicating? Simply that there's an expectation. A kid is having difficulty meeting. Um, Now, us mental health professionals, we like to categorize things. One of the things we like to categorize and have been trying to categorize for a very long time is kids concerning behaviors. Um, I don't know if those categories have moved the ball forward significantly, but let me give you some examples of what I mean by categories. If we were to rely on the trauma literature for our categories, we would have the categories of, these are categories of concerning behaviors: fight, flight, and freeze, which is fine, except that you're still talking about the kid's concerning behavior. All you've done is put it into 3 different buckets. Um, you still don't have the most important information you need to really be helping this kid. There's still information missing. If we were to rely on the mother lode of categories of concerning behaviors, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, we would be the DSM-5, now in its at least fifth iteration, telling you that us mental health professionals are having difficulty making up our minds about what behaviors belong in the categories. We would be greeted with dozens of categories of behavior. Wait a second. When you're talking about a kid's psychiatric diagnosis, you're still talking about their behavior? Of course. Take a look at the diagnostic criteria for the vast majority of childhood psychiatric disorders, and what will you find? A long list of concerning behaviors. There's still information missing. We're going to get to the information that's been missing shortly. Um, I have categories of my own, though. They're fake. Um, I'm one of the few people who's willing to acknowledge that his categories are fake, but I use these 2 categories for a very important reason. They make a very important point for me, which will become clear momentarily. My categories of concerning behaviors are lucky and unlucky. What are lucky ways of communicating that you're having difficulty meeting certain expectations? I'm not going to be exhaustive here either. Whining, pouting, sulking, withdrawing, crying. Why are those ways of communicating that you're having difficulty meeting certain expectations lucky? Those ways aren't going to get you popped into timeout, not going to get you held in from recess, not going to get you held after school, not going to get you detention, suspension, expulsion, not going to get you hit. Hit? Yeah, still very popular in American families. Still, many people don't know this, still very popular in the public schools in the United States of America, in 17 different states, still, Connecticut being not being one of them. Those those lucky ways of communicating that you're having difficulty meeting certain expectations aren't going to get you pinned to the ground by 2 to 4 adults, what's known as a restraint, not going to get you thrown into a locked or blocked closet-sized room, what's known as a seclusion. But best of all, those lucky ways of communicating that you're having difficulty meeting certain expectations are highly likely to elicit empathy, nurturance, support from your caregivers. Now, that's a lucky kid. That's not the kind of kid I've been working with for over 4 decades now. I've been working with the unlucky variety. What are unlucky ways of communicating that you're having difficulty meeting certain expectations? Not going to be exhaustive here either. Plus, you already know. But things like screaming, swearing, hitting, spitting, kicking, biting, throwing, destroying, running. Why are those ways of communicating that you're having difficulty meeting certain expectations unlucky? Well, those ways are far more likely to have you on the receiving end of all those punitive, exclusionary, disciplinary procedures I just mentioned. And those ways of communicating that you're having difficulty meeting certain expectations are far less likely to elicit empathy, nurturance, support from your caregivers, even though we've known for a very long time that whether your frustration response is lucky or unlucky, it's communicating the exact same thing. There's an expectation you're having difficulty reliably meeting. What's the only difference between lucky and unlucky frustration responses? How we treat the kids who exhibit those responses. Kids with unlucky frustration responses get the most harsh, punitive, exclusionary discipline our society has to offer, even though their frustration responses are communicating the exact same thing. Um, Now, as it relates to all kids have unsolved problems. D- Does a kid have to have unlucky frustration responses to have an unsolved problem? No, they just have to have difficulty meeting an expectation to have an unsolved problem, which is why I would be using this model with every kid, not just the ones with concerning behaviors, not just at school, not just at home, everywhere. What's the premium in this model? Identifying a kid's unsolved problems. What's going to be your homework assignment following this session? Make a list of every expectation the kid you're thinking about right now, whether it's your own kid in your own home or a kid in your classroom. Make a list of every expectation the kid is having difficulty reliably meeting. For the kids who've been struggling for a very long time, don't be surprised if that list is very long. The list of unsolved problems just continues to grow when all we're focused on are frustration responses and modifying them. Because you see, rewarding and punishing, those aren't problem-solving strategies. Those are behavior modification strategies. Why do so many kids have such big piles of unsolved problems? Because for a very long time, all we've been trying to do is modify their frustration responses. We haven't yet identified their unsolved problems. We haven't yet solved them. That's key theme number one. As you can tell, it's a big one. It completely changes the playing field. It completely changes what we're focused on. It completely changes what we're trying to do something about. It's huge. And it's huge in other ways too. But let's move on to the next key theme. Key theme number two, huge. Now that we're solving problems with kids, we need to think about what kind of problem solvers we want to be. Us adults, we tend to be real keen on problem solving of the unilateral kind. That's where the adult decides what's making it hard for a kid to meet an expectation. We divine it, and the adult decides what the solution is. We divine that too. None of which you are doing in this model. In this model, we operate on a very critical recognition. You want to solve a problem with a kid, and not just one with concerning behavior, any kid. You're going to need a teammate. You're going to need a partner. Who's your partner? The kid. See, this is problem solving of the collaborative kind. And by the way, next slide, please. The kid, generally speaking, is going to be delighted to help you out. The kid has probably been wondering for a very long time, how come us caregivers, once again, whether parent, educator, staff member, soccer coach, how come us caregivers um, have been so busy trying to solve those problems, if we even focused on the problems, all by ourselves? Um, in this model, us caregivers, we got a partner, the kid. And we have just arrived at the first of two key mantras of this model. There's five key themes, but there's two key mantras. It's up on the screen. Ask the kid. This is an ask the kid model. You want to find out what's making it hard for a kid to meet a particular expectation. In this model, you're asking the kid. The kid is your number one source of information. You want some ideas for what some solutions could be? Ask the kid. Kids have excellent ideas for solutions as well. In other words, this is something you're doing with the kid, not to the kid. And that is another huge shift for most of us caregivers. Now, whenever I bring that up, a few questions pop up, like, what if the kid won't talk to you? I love those kids. We refer to them as kids who can talk but aren't. What if the kid is non-speaking? Love those kids too. We refer to those kids as kids who aren't talking because they can't. Um, let's talk about population number one, the kids who can talk but aren't. I find that the kids who can talk but aren't will talk once we change the subject. Once we stop trying to talk with them about their concerning behavior, our favorite topic, by the way, which just causes them to think they're in trouble, become defensive, and stop talking and start talking with them about things they've been struggling with for a very long time. I find not only do they talk, we have difficulty getting them to stop. And people solve problems collaboratively with non-speaking kids in one way or another all the time. It's not that the kid's not communicating, it's that the kid's not communicating through our preferred modality, the spoken word. But I'm always telling people, don't sell those non-speaking kids short. They can be engaged in one way or the other in the process of solving the problems that are affecting their lives. Big question that I get from educators is related to the four-letter word that plagues all new initiatives in schools, and for good reason, TIME, time. We don't have a ton of TIME time for me to talk about that, but here's what I'll tell you. This model is going to save you time because I'll tell you what takes forever. Having unsolved problems go perpetually unsolved and cause concerning behavior perpetually, that takes forever. Doesn't take anywhere nearly the same amount of time to identify and solve the problems that are causing those frustration responses. Now, one of the biggest questions I get from parents and educators is if we're not using consequences, how are we going to hold the kid accountable? I love that question because, see, I've never thought that consequences were a particularly effective way of holding kids accountable. When you're consequencing a kid, the kid is the passive recipient of your imposed solutions, your imposed consequences, no thinking, no engagement, no accountability. You want to hold a kid accountable? Engage them in the process of solving the problems that are causing their concerning behaviors. Now that's accountability. And that's key theme number two. In this model, you got a partner. You're not all on your own. In this model, you're solving problems collaboratively. Huge. Let's move on to the next slide. Now that we're solving problems with kids and now that we are doing it collaboratively, we have got to think about our timing. As you all know, a great deal of the intervention that takes place for kids with concerning behaviors takes place in the heat of the moment, emergently, reactively, after an unsolved problem has already set in motion concerning behavior. Um, that's late. You're now in crisis management mode. You don't want to be in crisis management mode. You want to be in crisis prevention mode. 99.9% of what you're doing in this model is planned, proactive. Next slide, please. And that leads us to the second key mantra of the model. Don't be late. We're late a lot. In schools, we are late a lot. In families, we are late a lot. Chapter 3 in that new book I mentioned, The Kids Who Aren't Okay, chapter 3 is called Set Up to Be Late. It's mostly a school book, although I suspect parents would get a lot out of it too. In chapter 3 of that book, I go through all of the things we do in schools that are late. We'll get into that in a second. It's almost as if we're set up to be late. It's almost as if we expect to be late. There's your mantra. Don't be late. We don't have to be set up to be late. Being late is not a given. We could set ourselves up to be early. Uh, we could be in crisis prevention mode with just a little bit of intentionality, with just a little bit of commitment. We could be early, not late. Some things that go on in schools that are early, that are late, not early. Um, well, we're giving kids a lot of breaks these days, thanks to a model of intervention known as PBIS. We're giving kids a lot of breaks. When do kids get breaks? When they are beginning to struggle with a particular task. Now, generally speaking, the word when tells you you're probably late. as in the question, what should I do when? What should you do when? That's a setup for being late. Um, the big question we should be asking is, what should we be do before? Um, but we're trained to give kids breaks when they begin struggling with a particular task. This probably explains why I've worked with kids who were getting 10, 15, 20 breaks a day at school. 10, 15, 20 breaks on Monday simply guarantees 10, 15, 20 breaks on Tuesday. That's because taking a break is not only late, it's also not going to solve any of the problems that are causing the kid to be late in the first place. Taking a break is late. When are they not calm? When they're having difficulty meeting a particular expectation. So the calming corner is late. This explains why I've worked with kids who were accessing the calming corner 10, 15 times a day. 10, 15 calming corners on Tuesday simply guarantees 10, 15 calming corners on Wednesday, because not only is the calming corner late, the calming corner isn't going to solve any of the problems that are causing the kid to access the calming corner in the first place. Schools also have, and I'm not being exhaustive here, this is an entire chapter of how we're set up to be late. I'm just going through some of the highlights. Um, Schools have people whose job title tells us that they're the ones who show up on the scene when it's late. They're often called crisis intervention specialists, behavior intervention specialists, whatever the job title. They're the late staff because we expect to be late. I'm going to repeat myself. We don't have to be late. Being late is not a given. They could just as easily be the early staff with just a little intentionality, with just a little commitment. We could be early, not late. In homes, many parents are taught to use timeout. When does the timeout occur? Way late in the sequence that begins with an expectation a kid is having difficulty reliably meeting. Then we adults insist that the kid meet the expectation. If the kid is still having difficulty meeting the expectation, we insist harder, causing concerning behavior. And now the kid is in timeout. Boy, are we late. And a timeout isn't going to solve any of the problems that caused the behaviors that caused the kid to end up in the timeout in the first place. Don't be late. Um, how can we stay away from being late? By focusing on problems, which are early. Unsolved problems are early. The frustration responses they cause, those are late. If all we're focused on is frustration responses, we're going to be late every time. If we're focused on the expectations a kid is having difficulty meeting, we've set ourselves up to be early. And by the way, when you start making that list that I've already said is going to be your homework assignment, the list of expectations, the child you're thinking of right now, whether it's your own child or your student, whatever expectations they're having difficulty reliably meeting, you're going to make a list. You're going to see that the vast majority of those unsolved problems are old, old expectations the kid has been having difficulty meeting for a very long time. Now, that tells us that whatever you've done so far to try to address that unsolved problem hasn't worked. The kid is still having difficulty meeting the expectation. That's good to know. Probably because we haven't been focused on the unsolved problem. We've been focused on frustration responses instead. That's huge. Um, but if they're old, they're also highly predictable. This isn't the first time your kid has had difficulty brushing their teeth before going to bed at night. If you're a parent, it's the 97th time your kid has had difficulty brushing their teeth before going to bed at night. That's an old unsolved problem, and it's still unsolved. If you're an educator, this isn't the first time this kid has had difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math. It's about the 37th time the kid has had difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math. That is an old unsolved problem, and it still isn't solved because it's still causing a frustration response. And they're in a detention or a suspension that's going to solve that problem. Detentions and suspensions aren't problem-solving strategies. Neither are stickers, timeouts, expulsions. Boy, that list of unsolved problems is not only going to help us focus on something different, problems, not the behaviors being caused by them. It's going to set us up to be early instead of late because once we identify those unsolved problems, this is a very predictable kid. Intervention can be almost exclusively proactive. Goodness, don't be late. Next slide, please. We have now arrived at key theme number 4, which is the mentality of the collaborative and proactive solutions model. The philosophy, 6 little words that no matter where I'm lucky enough to travel all over the world telling people about this model, whenever I ask them what part of the model most got their heads turned around, the number one response, far and away, are these 6 little words. Kids do well if they can. The belief that if this kid could do well, they would do well. If the kid isn't doing well, something must be getting in the way. Next slide, please. What's getting in the way? What the research tells us is getting in the way. Um, Unsolved problems. And the skills to handle those unsolved problems, the frustration caused by those unsolved problems, adaptively. You see, for a very long time, we've been thinking that kids' maladaptive frustration responses were a sign of poor motivation, but there isn't a single study telling us that maladaptive frustration responses are due to poor motivation. What the research that has accumulated on kids with concerning behaviors over the past 40 to 50 years tells us is that kids who are struggling with maladaptive frustration responses are struggling with certain skills. Skills like, this was on an earlier slide, but we don't have to go back. Skills like flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving, emotion regulation. Skills the research tells us and has been telling us for a very long time kids with concerning behaviors tend to struggle with. Skills. Um, Skills are a much more compassionate, much more accurate, much more productive set of lenses. Um, the kid would very much prefer to be doing well. The kid would very much prefer to be meeting your expectations because kids do well if they can. Now, the reason kids do well if they can is a big deal for a lot of people is because of a much more popular alternative mentality that's been floating around out there for a very long time called kids do well if they wanna. Kids do well if they can, and kids do well if they wanna are two completely different mentalities. They have completely different implications for what you're thinking about this kid and what you're doing with or to this kid to try to help this kid. If you think a kid isn't doing well because they don't wanna do well, then you'd have to explain why they don't wanna do well. And as you've already heard, for a very long time, we've been explaining why a kid wouldn't want to do well with characterizations like attention seeking, manipulative, coercive, unmotivated, limit testing, none of which are true. Kids don't have maladaptive frustration responses because they're trying to seek attention, manipulate us, coerce us, test limits, or because they're unmotivated. They have maladaptive frustration responses. The research has been crystal clear on this for a very long time because they're struggling with certain skills. This kid would very much prefer to be doing well because kids do well if they can. Something's getting in the way. What's getting in the way? Those unsolved problems are getting in the way. The expectations they're having difficulty reliably meeting. It's those unsolved problems that are setting off frustration responses. Once again, frustration responses are simply the way in which the kid is communicating to us that they're having difficulty meeting one of those expectations. And as you already know, what we've been doing for a very long time is punishing frustration responses and trying to reward kids to exhibit replacement behaviors, which we're busy teaching and reteaching, none of which solves any of the unsolved problems that are causing the frustration responses in the first place. Those unsolved problems are early. Their frustration responses are late. We have got to turn this around. Kids do well if they can is a big part of the mentality that helps us do that. And finally, key theme number 5, I think, coming up on this next slide. Oops, keep going. Doing well is preferable. For me, a statement of the obvious. Of course, doing well is preferable. Preference for doing well explains why most of us do well most of the time. We prefer it. So do kids with concerning behavior. Kids with concerning behavior prefer doing well too. The difference between a well-behaved kid and a kid with concerning behavior is not that the well-behaved kid prefers doing well and the kid with concerning behaviors doesn't. That's not right. It's that the well-behaved kid has skills that the, kid with concerning behaviors is struggling with. Once again, flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving, emotion regulation. Let me give a school example here. Picture this, two kids sitting at a table at school, both of them struggling with the exact same math task. Apparently, both of them are struggling with some math skills. Otherwise, they'd be doing the math because kids do well if they can. One of the two kids is calmly raising their hand and saying, "Can I get some help over here?" The other one just tipped over the desk and ran out of the room. What's the difference between those two kids? Well, once again, they're both struggling with some math skills. Otherwise, they'd be doing the math. Once again, because kids do well if they can. But one of them is struggling with some additional skills. Once again, flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving, emotion regulation. Yeah, that's the kid who just tipped over the desk and ran out of the room. Now we've just arrived at the fork in the road. What are we going to do with the desk tipping running kid? Well, as I've already mentioned, if we're going to go, we've just arrived at the fork in the road. If we go down the fork we've been on for a very long time, we're going to teach and reteach replacement behaviors for desk tipping and running. We're going to reward the kid when they exhibit the replacement behavior. Good chance we still punish them if they don't exhibit the replacement behavior. And you know what? If you did that, maybe you'd make a dent in the desk tipping and running, but I can promise you there's something you wouldn't have touched. The kid is still having difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math. In this model, you're going down a different track. In this model, you are proactively identifying the unsolved problem that's causing that concerning behavior, difficulty completing the double-digit division problem on the worksheet in math. You are collaboratively and proactively solving that problem. And once that problem is solved, the kid isn't going to exhibit a frustration response anymore because, next slide, please, solved problems don't cause frustration responses. Only unsolved problems do. In this model, you are improving behavior by solving the problems that are causing them. I know I'm repeating myself here, but it's worth it. Those unsolved problems are early. The frustration responses being caused by them are late. The problem solving is both proactive. We're not waiting for the kid to have difficulty completing the double-digit division problems on the worksheet in math. Yet again, it's an old unsolved problem. Most are. We're going to identify it proactively. That sets the stage for us to solve it proactively. And the problem solving is also collaborative. The kid is indispensable to the problem solving process. You can't solve the problem without the kid. You could try, but I find that those solutions, generally speaking, don't work very well. All right. Goodness, we've covered a lot of territory here. Let's see what's on the next slide before we stop and take a few questions before we're done. I want to cover one very important point here about why focusing on behavior and modifying it um, is a very limited approach to helping kids. First of all, you've already heard rewards and punishments don't solve any problems. They weren't designed to. They aren't problem-solving strategies. Not only that, they can be distracting. They cause us caregivers to focus on a kid's frustration responses rather than on the problems that are causing those frustration responses. And this is up there in bold. If we continue to focus on the kid's concerning behavior instead of the problems that are causing it, we will never find out what's making it hard for a kid to meet a particular expectation. Um, as you all know, there is significant disproportionality in the ways in which rewards and especially punishments are administered. We punish Black and brown kids and those with disabilities, this is in our schools, greatly out of proportion to their numbers. And that um, is an issue worth addressing. Here's what I always say. Those punitive exclusionary disciplinary practices aren't good for anybody. There wouldn't be disproportionality if we weren't using them in the first place. And it's time for us to cover a very important term, developmental variability. A very fancy way of saying every kid is different. So if every kid is different, then the definition of good teaching and good parenting is what we talked about earlier, meeting every kid where they're at. But because of developmental variability, some kids, for any number of reasons, are going to have more unsolved problems than others. If we're going to be disproportional, better to be disproportional in solving problems with kids then in doling out detentions, suspensions, expulsions, hitting, restraint, seclusion, those interventions do not help us meet kids where they're at because they don't solve any of the problems that are causing kids' frustration responses. Developmental variability is guaranteed. See, a long time ago, I was trained in the reward and punishment way of doing things. I switched gears fairly early in my career, and one of the biggest things that caused me to switch gears was noticing that the kids with concerning behaviors that I was working with had well-behaved siblings. See, I had been taught that concerning behavior in kids was due to passive, permissive, inconsistent, non-contingent, inept parenting. How did it come to pass that those parents have well-behaved kids? Because it's not passive, permissive, inconsistent, non-contingent, inept parenting. The kids are struggling with certain skills. And it's time to stop blaming parents for the concerning behaviors of their children. Um, that doesn't help anybody collaborate with those parents. They have a kid who, like all of us, is developmentally variable, but their kid's developmental variability is related to certain unsolved problems and whether the kid has the skills to handle frustration adaptively. Developmental variability is huge. It helps explain why I have been saying lately, this takes people by surprise, that non-compliance is good. Now, out of context, that would make no sense whatsoever. In context, it makes perfect sense. You all now know why non-compliance is good, why concerning behavior is good. It tells us that there's an expectation a kid is having difficulty meeting. And if you're a parent or an educator, you want to know that, right? Not only is non-compliance good, it's informative if we take the time to collaborate with kids on finding out what's getting in the way of them meeting those expectations and solving those problems together. Non-compliance is good. Non-compliance is informative. Out of context, that makes no sense whatsoever. In context, it's true. And finally, next slide, please. Here's the two things you're going to be learning more about in our next session together: how to identify those skills and unsolved problems, and how to solve those problems collaboratively and proactively. The two key things you want to be good at when you're learning this model. Once you're good at those two things, generally speaking, you're good to go. And those are the two things we're going to be covering. I can't wait. Before we stop for today, though, let's see if any questions have come in.